My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I thought my family loved me until they celebrated stealing everything my uncle left behind. Uncle Bob wasn't just family, he was the man who pulled me from the wreckage of my childhood when my parents died in that car accident on Route 33. He was the one who taught me how to swing a hammer without hitting my thumb, how to read blueprints like poetry, and how to build something lasting with your own two hands. When he passed away from lung cancer last spring, they gathered around his casket like vultures, whispering about property values and inheritance taxes. What happened at that law firm 3 months later would shatter every assumption I had about blood loyalty and expose the kind of greed that makes people forget their own souls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Uncle Bob died, I was holding his hand in room 314 at Cedar Falls General Hospital. His breathing had grown shallow over the past week, but his grip remained strong, calloused from 40 years of construction work. The machines beeped steadily around us while morning light filtered through those thin hospital blinds, casting everything in a pale yellow glow. He looked at me with those deep brown eyes, the same ones that had watched me grow from a scared 8-year-old into a woman who could frame a house and manage a payroll. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke his final words to me that morning. "Sarah, you remember what I told you about the strong foundation? Everything else can fall apart, but if the foundation holds, you can rebuild. You're my foundation, kiddo. Don't let them convince you otherwise." I thought he was talking about construction principles, the way he always did when life got complicated. Uncle Bob had a habit of turning every life lesson into something about building codes or load-bearing walls. I squeezed his hand and promised him I would remember. 3 hours later, he was gone, and I found myself standing in that sterile hallway, feeling like the last person on Earth who truly understood what Cedar Falls had lost. Uncle Bob wasn't just a local contractor who employed half the town. He was the guy who showed up with his truck and tools when the Henderson family lost their roof in the tornado. He was the man who hired kids straight out of high school and taught them trades that could feed their families for generations. He was steady, reliable, honest, everything I tried to be because he showed me how. The funeral service at St. Mary's was standing room only. Uncle Bob would have laughed at all the fuss, probably would have said something about how he never drew crowds unless someone was offering free coffee and donuts. Pastor Williams spoke about a life well lived, about a man who built more than houses in Cedar Falls. He built community, trust, hope for families who needed a second chance. I sat in the front pew, wearing the black dress Uncle Bob had bought me for my college graduation, the one I never thought I'd wear to his funeral. My sister Jessica sat beside me, dabbing her eyes with tissues, playing the grieving niece perfectly. My brother David sat stone-faced, checking his phone periodically like he had somewhere more important to be. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Bob's only living sibling, wept dramatically into a handkerchief, though I couldn't remember her visiting him once during his illness. Cousin Mark, Patricia's son, kept glancing around the church like he was counting heads, estimating something I couldn't quite figure out. The whole family dynamic felt strange, performative somehow. These people had been absent from Uncle Bob's life for years, but suddenly they were center stage, accepting condolences and speaking about him like they'd been close. I knew better. I was the one who drove him to chemotherapy appointments. I was the one who sat with him during those long nights when the pain medication wasn't enough. I was the one who helped him update his business files and organize his financial paperwork when his hands started shaking too badly to write clearly. After the service, we gathered at Uncle Bob's farmhouse on Riverside Road for the traditional meal. The old place looked exactly the same: weathered barn siding, wraparound porch with the swing he'd built by hand, workshop windows reflecting the afternoon sun. I'd spent countless weekends here, learning how to use every tool in that workshop, helping him restore the 1920s farmhouse room by room. The kitchen still smelled like his coffee, strong and bitter the way he liked it. His reading glasses were still folded on the counter next to a stack of construction magazines he'd never get to finish. Jessica moved through the house like she was already redecorating, commenting on the crown molding and hardwood floors with the eye of someone planning renovations. She kept mentioning how much work the place needed, how expensive it would be to maintain, how it might be better to sell quickly before the market shifted. David wandered through Uncle Bob's workshop, picking up hand tools and testing their weight like he was at an auction preview. Aunt Patricia stationed herself in the living room, holding court with distant relatives and neighbors, speaking about Bob's legacy and how the family would honor his memory. I found myself drawn to Uncle Bob's office, a small room off the kitchen where he kept his business records and personal papers. His desk was still cluttered with invoices and job estimates, his coffee mug still ringed with dried coffee stains. On the wall hung his contractor's license, faded now, and photos of construction projects spanning 4 decades. There were pictures of me too, learning to use a level at age 10, helping him install kitchen cabinets at 15, graduating from Ohio State with my business degree while he beamed proudly in the background. The conversation in the kitchen grew louder as the evening wore on. I heard Jessica talking about property taxes and maintenance costs. David mentioned something about liquidating assets quickly to avoid complications. Aunt Patricia spoke in hushed tones about family obligations and making practical decisions. None of them mentioned the construction company that employed 17 people in Cedar Falls. None of them talked about the contracts Uncle Bob had signed for projects extending into next year. None of them seemed to care about anything beyond the dollar signs they were already calculating in their heads. That night, I drove back to my apartment above Murphy's Bakery on Maple Street, feeling hollowed out and exhausted. The place was tiny, just 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living room that doubled as my home office. I could hear Tom Murphy starting the ovens downstairs, preparing for the next day's bread. The familiar sounds were comforting, routine in a world that suddenly felt unstable. I sat at my small table and looked through the papers Uncle Bob had given me over the years, copies of business licenses, insurance policies, contracts with my signature as his designated business partner. I'd been managing the day-to-day operations of Mitchell Family Construction for the past 3 years, ever since Uncle Bob's arthritis made it difficult for him to handle the paperwork and client meetings. The company was thriving under our partnership. We'd expanded from residential repairs to commercial projects, hired skilled craftsmen, built a reputation for quality work delivered on time and within budget. Uncle Bob had trained me not just in construction techniques, but in business management, client relations, and the ethics of honest work. He'd always said the company would be mine someday.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That he was grooming me to carry on the Mitchell name in construction. Those conversations felt like promises now, spoken commitments that gave me hope, even as grief threatened to overwhelm everything else. 2 weeks after the funeral, Jennifer Collins from Collins & Associates law firm called to schedule the will reading. Her voice was professionally pleasant but somehow unfamiliar. I'd expected to hear from Harrison & Webb, the firm that had handled Uncle Bob's legal affairs for 20 years. When I mentioned this, Miss Collins explained that Mr. Harrison had recently retired and Uncle Bob had transferred his affairs to their firm shortly before his death. Something about her explanation felt rehearsed, but grief makes everything feel suspicious, so I didn't question it further. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at their downtown office on Main Street. I took time off work, which wasn't difficult since I was essentially running the construction company while waiting for legal clarity about its future ownership. The other family members would be there too, Miss Collins explained, as they were all named beneficiaries in Uncle Bob's will. This news surprised me because Uncle Bob had often complained about their absence from his life, their lack of interest in anything beyond their own immediate concerns. I spent the days leading up to the will reading, trying to prepare emotionally for whatever lay ahead. Uncle Bob had never been specific about his estate plans, but he'd made it clear that he expected me to continue running the construction business. He'd been teaching me every aspect of the operation, from estimating jobs, to managing subcontractors, to maintaining client relationships. The company was my life's work as much as his, the foundation of my career and identity in Cedar Falls. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Ohio weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I wore to client meetings and business presentations. I wanted to look professional, competent, like someone worthy of inheriting a successful construction company. The drive downtown took longer than usual because of road construction on Main Street, one of the projects Uncle Bob's company had bid on but lost to a larger firm from Columbus. Collins and Associates occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building, the kind of place that tried too hard to look prestigious with its dark wood paneling and leather furniture. The reception area was decorated with generic landscape paintings and motivational plaques about success and determination. Miss Collins greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed more suited to selling insurance than discussing someone's final wishes. The conference room was larger than necessary for our small family gathering, with a long mahogany table and chairs that squeaked when you shifted position. Jessica arrived early, dressed in expensive black clothing that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than a legal proceeding. She'd had her hair styled specially for the occasion and wore jewelry I'd never seen before. Clearly she'd been shopping in anticipation of good news. David showed up 10 minutes late, still wearing his work clothes from the auto parts store where he managed inventory. He looked uncomfortable in the formal setting, constantly adjusting his tie and checking his phone. Aunt Patricia made an entrance worthy of a soap opera, arriving with Cousin Mark in tow and speaking loudly about traffic delays and parking difficulties. She wore a black dress with a pearl necklace, playing the role of grieving sister with theatrical precision. Mark looked nervous, sweating despite the air conditioning, repeatedly running his hands through his hair like someone trying to calm himself before a job interview. We settled around the table while Miss Collins arranged papers with deliberate ceremony. She explained the standard legal procedures for will readings, speaking in that careful lawyer voice that makes everything sound more complicated than necessary. The document she placed before us looked official enough, multiple pages bound with blue backing, sealed with official stamps and signatures. She began reading in a monotone voice that drained all personality from Uncle Bob's final words. The will started with standard legal language about mental competency and sound mind, then moved into specific bequests. Aunt Patricia received Uncle Bob's personal effects, furniture, photographs, household items with sentimental value. Cousin Mark was granted Uncle Bob's truck and his collection of antique hand tools, items worth several $1,000s. David inherited Uncle Bob's savings account, which contained approximately $30,000. Jessica received the farmhouse and its 35 acres, valued at close to $200,000. Then Miss Collins reached my section of the will. According to the document, I was granted Uncle Bob's personal workshop equipment and a small cash bequest of $5,000. Nothing about the construction company, nothing about the business we'd built together. Nothing about the contracts I'd been managing or the employees who depended on the work we'd secured. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. I stared at the papers in front of me, reading the words again and again, hoping they would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. This couldn't be right. Uncle Bob and I had discussed the company's future countless times. He'd trained me specifically to take over operations. He'd introduced me to clients as his successor, his business partner, the person who would carry the Mitchell name forward in construction. Jessica broke the silence with a small gasp that sounded more like excitement than surprise. She pressed her hand to her chest and looked around the table with wide eyes. David leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Aunt Patricia dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, but I could see triumph beneath her tears. Cousin Mark actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the conference room walls. "We won," Jessica whispered, then louder, "We actually won." She looked directly at me when she said it, her eyes bright with vindication. David nodded his agreement, pulling out his phone to calculate something. Aunt Patricia reached across the table to squeeze Jessica's hand, both women suddenly animated with joy they couldn't quite hide behind their funeral expressions. I felt the blood drain from my face as the reality of the situation settled over me. They had been expecting this outcome, they had been planning for it, preparing for it, celebrating it before it even happened. This wasn't grief or surprise or confusion about Uncle Bob's final wishes. This was victory, pure and simple, the successful conclusion of something they had orchestrated while I remained completely unaware. Miss Collins cleared her throat and continued reading additional clauses about property taxes and estate administration, but her words became background noise to the roaring in my ears. I watched my family members exchange meaningful glances and barely suppressed smiles, finally understanding that I had been excluded from more than just Uncle Bob's will. I had been excluded from whatever conversations had led to this moment, whatever planning had resulted in my professional life being dismantled with a few paragraphs of legal language. The construction company, according to the will, was to be sold immediately with proceeds distributed equally among all beneficiaries. 17 jobs would disappear, contracts would be voided, the Mitchell name would vanish from Cedar Falls construction work after 4 decades of honest service. Everything Uncle Bob had built, everything he had taught me to build, would be liquidated for cash to fund Jessica's decorating projects and David's get-rich-quick schemes. As Miss Collins finished reading, I felt something Uncle Bob had taught me about construction settle into my mind. When a building starts to collapse, you don't stand there watching, you get out fast and then figure out what went wrong with the foundation. I excused myself from the conference room, walked calmly to the parking garage, and sat in my truck for 20 minutes, trying to understand how my entire future had just been demolished with legal paperwork I never saw coming. But Uncle Bob had taught me something else about construction work. When a building collapses, sometimes it's not because the foundation was weak, sometimes it's because someone deliberately damaged the support structures. And if that's what happened, there's usually evidence left behind in the wreckage, evidence that tells the real story about what brought everything down. Parts 2, 5 The betrayal unfolds. That evening, I sat in my truck outside Uncle Bob's farmhouse on Riverside Road, watching lights flicker on in windows that would soon belong to Jessica. The reality of losing everything felt surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold in slow motion. I had my own key to the house, earned through years of helping Uncle Bob with repairs and renovations, but suddenly using it felt like trespassing. The workshop where he'd taught me to build custom cabinets, the kitchen where we'd planned construction projects over morning coffee, the porch where we'd discussed business strategies during summer evenings, all of it would disappear from my life as completely as Uncle Bob himself. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. Figured you'd want to collect your tools before we start clearing things out. Nothing accusatory in the words, but the underlying message was clear. I was now a visitor with limited access to the place that had been my second home for 20 years. The casual cruelty of it hit harder than outright hostility would have. She was being practical, efficient, already moving forward with plans that had apparently been months in the making. I drove to Murphy's Bakery and climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, feeling like I was ascending to a prison cell. The space that had seemed cozy and efficient that morning now felt cramped and suffocating. From my living room window, I could see the Cedar Falls construction yard, where Uncle Bob's trucks were parked in neat rows, waiting for morning crews that might not exist much longer. The company logo painted on the office door, Mitchell Family Construction, established 1981, would be scraped away and replaced with a for sale sign before Christmas. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by thoughts that felt like puzzle pieces refusing to fit together. Uncle Bob had been sharp right up until his death, managing complex construction schedules and client negotiations with the same precision he'd shown for decades. His handwriting had remained steady, his memory clear, his judgment sound. The man who had built a successful business from nothing, who had navigated economic downturns and industry changes with strategic thinking, wouldn't have destroyed everything on a whim or forgotten promises made to the person who'd been his partner and protégé. Morning brought rain against my windows and the familiar sound of Tom Murphy's delivery truck arriving with flour and sugar for the day's baking. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen and tried to imagine explaining to the construction crew that their jobs would disappear because Uncle Bob had supposedly decided I wasn't worthy of inheriting what we'd built together. These were skilled craftsmen who'd worked for Mitchell Family Construction for years, men with families and mortgages who trusted the company's stability. How do you tell someone that their livelihood is being sacrificed so that distant relatives can cash out quickly? I called the office and spoke with Maria Santos, our office manager, who had been handling scheduling and client communications since Uncle Bob's illness began. Her voice carried the same confusion I felt when I explained the will's contents. "But Mr. Bob always said you were taking over," she said quietly. "Just last month he updated the business insurance to list you as primary operator. Why would he change everything so suddenly?" I couldn't answer her question because I didn't understand it myself. The next few days passed in a haze of practical details that felt increasingly wrong. Jessica called to discuss timeline for clearing out the farmhouse, speaking about Uncle Bob's belongings like inventory to be processed efficiently. David left voicemails about meeting with real estate agents to evaluate the property's market value. Aunt Patricia sent texts about organizing Uncle Bob's personal papers, signed documents that would need to be transferred to appropriate recipients. None of them mentioned the construction company's employees or pending contracts. None of them asked about clients who had paid deposits for work scheduled through the spring. None of them seemed concerned about the commitments Uncle Bob had made to complete projects for families who trusted the Mitchell name. Their focus remained entirely on assets that could be converted to cash quickly, cleanly, with minimal complications. I found myself driving past the farmhouse repeatedly, studying details I'd never noticed before. The mailbox Uncle Bob had installed himself, painted with careful precision in the company colors. The gravel driveway he'd graded and maintained, wide enough for construction vehicles to turn around safely. The workshop addition he'd built when the business expanded, designed with electrical capacity for industrial equipment. Every improvement reflected long-term thinking, permanent investment in a property he planned to keep forever. Thursday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from William Harrison, the lawyer who had handled Uncle Bob's affairs for 2 decades before his supposed retirement. His voice sounded strained when he introduced himself, like someone delivering difficult news. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've been hearing troubling things about Robert's estate disposition. Would you have time to meet privately? I need to discuss some concerns about the documentation being circulated." We arranged to meet at the diner on Route 33, a neutral location where Uncle Bob and I had often discussed business over lunch. Mr. Harrison looked older than I remembered, his hair completely gray now, his movements careful and deliberate. He ordered coffee but didn't touch it, focusing instead on papers he'd brought in a weathered briefcase. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to accept," he began slowly, "but I believe Robert's actual wishes are being deliberately misrepresented." According to Mr. Harrison, Uncle Bob had never transferred his legal affairs to Collins and Associates. In fact, he had updated his will just 6 weeks before his death, working directly with Harrison to ensure his intentions were documented clearly and legally. The updated will had been filed through a private channel, sealed by court order to prevent interference from potential beneficiaries who might contest his decisions. Uncle Bob had specifically requested this protection because he suspected certain family members might attempt to challenge his choices. Mr. Harrison handed me a certified copy of documents that looked nothing like what Miss Collins had read at the law firm. In Uncle Bob's actual will, I inherited controlling interest in Mitchell Family Construction, the farmhouse and its acreage, and a trust fund established specifically to ensure the business remained operational during ownership transition. The other family members received modest cash bequests, but nothing approaching the windfall they had celebrated so enthusiastically. The document included a handwritten letter from Uncle Bob, dated just 3 weeks before his death. His familiar penmanship covered 2 pages with thoughts he'd apparently wanted to preserve for exactly this situation. "Sarah," he had written, "if you're reading this, it means they did exactly what I feared they would do. Your sister and brother have been pressuring me for months about the inheritance, making assumptions about what they deserve for simply sharing the Mitchell name. But you earned everything I'm leaving you. You worked beside me, learned the business, treated my employees with respect, honored your commitments. You're not getting this inheritance because we're related. You're getting it because you've proven yourself worthy of the responsibility." The letter continued with specific details about family conversations I'd never heard about. Jessica had visited Uncle Bob 3 times during his illness, each visit focused on his estate plans and her expectation of inheriting the farmhouse. David had called repeatedly to discuss the construction company's value and potential for quick sale. Aunt Patricia had suggested that Uncle Bob's illness might be affecting his judgment, implying that his long-term business partnership with me wasn't in the family's best interests. According to Mr. Harrison, Uncle Bob had become increasingly concerned about their motivations and behavior. He'd consulted with financial advisors about protecting his estate from potential challenges, worked with legal experts to ensure his actual will couldn't be contested or overturned, and made arrangements for independent verification of his mental competency during the document preparation process. Every precaution had been taken to prevent exactly what had apparently happened at Collins and Associates. But how is this possible? I asked, holding the authentic documents with shaking hands. How could they present a completely different will if this one is legally filed and sealed? Mr. Harrison's expression darkened as he explained the mechanics of estate fraud. Someone with access to Uncle Bob's personal information, medical records, and signature samples could potentially create convincing forgeries. If that person also had connections with unscrupulous legal services, they might successfully present false documents to unsuspecting beneficiaries. The key, he explained, was timing and confidence. Most people don't question inheritance documents presented by official-looking lawyers in professional settings. The real will wouldn't surface until the court began processing estate transfers, a bureaucratic procedure that could take months to complete. By then, emotional acceptance of the false inheritance might make beneficiaries less likely to investigate inconsistencies or challenge what they'd been told. Mr. Harrison had only learned about the false will reading through professional networks in Cedar Falls' legal community. Someone had mentioned seeing the Mitchell family at Collins and Associates, which surprised him because he'd never transferred Uncle Bob's file to that firm. When he investigated further, he discovered that Jennifer Collins had no legitimate connection to Uncle Bob's estate and shouldn't have had access to any documentation related to his affairs. I need to file a formal complaint with the court immediately, Mr. Harrison explained. This appears to be organized fraud designed to steal your inheritance and liquidate assets before the legal system can intervene. But I wanted to speak with you first, because the process will become public once court proceedings begin. Your family members will be notified that their inheritance claims are under investigation for potential fraud. The drive back to my apartment felt like traveling through someone else's life. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my future, my relationship with Uncle Bob's memory had been deliberately constructed to deceive me. The grief I'd been processing was complicated now by anger, confusion, and a growing understanding of how completely I'd been manipulated. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd stolen months of my life, letting me believe Uncle Bob had betrayed our partnership when he'd actually taken extraordinary
measures to protect it. That evening, I sat on my apartment steps and tried to imagine the conversations that had led to this moment. Jessica meeting with David to discuss inheritance expectations, Aunt Patricia coordinating with unknown contacts who could provide false legal documentation, Cousin Mark staying quiet while fraud was organized around Uncle Bob's deathbed. The planning and coordination required suggested this hadn't been a spontaneous decision. They had been working toward this outcome while I sat beside Uncle Bob during his final weeks, holding his hand and promising to remember his lessons about strong foundations. My phone rang just after sunset. David's number appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Jessica called, followed by Aunt Patricia. I ignored them all, finally understanding that their sudden interest in communicating with me wasn't about family relationships or shared grief. They were checking on my emotional state, monitoring my reactions, ensuring I remained convinced that Uncle Bob had genuinely disinherited me. The voicemails they left were masterpieces of manipulation disguised as concern. David wondered if I was okay, suggested that Uncle Bob's decision probably reflected his worry about burdening me with business responsibilities during my grief. Jessica offered to help me find a new job, maybe something less stressful than construction management. Aunt Patricia reminded me that family love wasn't dependent on inheritance amounts,
that Uncle Bob's real gift to me had been the knowledge and experience he'd shared over the years. Each message reinforced the same narrative: Uncle Bob had made a rational decision to spare me from responsibilities I wasn't ready to handle. They were protecting me from disappointment, helping me accept reality, encouraging me to move forward without dwelling on what might have been. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, designed to make me grateful for their support while accepting the loss of everything Uncle Bob had actually left for me. But Uncle Bob had taught me to recognize when structures weren't built to proper specifications. Something about their coordinated response felt engineered, like a demolition planned carefully to bring down a building without damaging surrounding property. They wanted me to collapse quietly, accepting their version of events without investigation or resistance. What they didn't understand was that Uncle Bob had also taught me what to do when you discover structural fraud. You bring in experts to examine the foundation and determine what can be salvaged from the wreckage. Friday morning, I met Mr. Harrison at the Hamilton County Courthouse to begin formal proceedings challenging the false will. The legal system moved with bureaucratic slowness that felt agonizing when your entire future hung in the balance, but Mr. Harrison assured me that Uncle Bob's actual will was properly documented and filed. The fraud investigation would take time, but the evidence was substantial enough to freeze all estate transfers until legitimate ownership could be established. As we walked up the courthouse steps, I thought about Uncle Bob's final words about foundations and rebuilding. I'd assumed he was talking about emotional resilience, the strength to continue after loss, but maybe he'd been more literal than I realized. Maybe he'd known that everything visible would be torn down by people who didn't understand the value of what they were destroying. Maybe he'd been telling me that the real foundation, legal documents, business relationships, community trust, would survive whatever demolition they attempted. The afternoon brought phone calls from Jessica and David that I finally answered. Their voices carried new tension when I mentioned speaking with Mr. Harrison about estate documentation. Jessica's questions became sharp, focused on exactly what the original lawyer had told me and whether I was planning to challenge the will reading. David asked repeatedly about my meeting at the courthouse, whether I understood that contesting wills was expensive and usually unsuccessful. Their concern felt different now, more urgent and less sympathetic. Instead of helping me accept Uncle Bob's supposed decision, they seemed worried about my growing understanding of what had actually happened. The family members who had been celebrating their victory just days earlier were now trying to discourage me from investigating the legal foundation of their claims. Their behavior was exactly what Uncle Bob had predicted in his letter: pressure disguised as concern, manipulation disguised as family loyalty. That evening, I drove to the construction company office and sat in the parking lot looking at Uncle Bob's trucks and equipment through the chain-link fence. 17 families depended on the jobs those vehicles represented. Dozens of clients had contracts for work extending through next spring. The Mitchell family construction reputation, built over 4 decades, would disappear if my family succeeded in liquidating everything for quick cash. But Uncle Bob had built more than a business. He'd built relationships, systems, legal protections that couldn't be dissolved with forged paperwork. The foundation he'd established was stronger than they realized, designed to withstand exactly this kind of attack. I just had to trust his planning and follow the legal process he'd put in place to protect what we'd built together. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since the false will reading, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Uncle Bob hadn't abandoned me or forgotten his promises. He'd anticipated this betrayal and taken measures to ensure the truth would eventually surface. The family members who thought they'd won were about to discover that stealing someone's inheritance requires more than enthusiasm and fake documentation. It requires actually outsmarting the person who built the foundation you're trying to destroy. And Uncle Bob had been building strong foundations his entire life. Part 6 My 9, The Investigation, deepened. Saturday morning arrived with a phone call that changed everything about how I understood my family's capacity for deception. Mr. Harrison's voice carried urgency when he asked me to meet him at his office immediately, explaining that new information had surfaced overnight that required immediate attention. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't just another legal formality, but a development that would fundamentally alter our understanding of how deeply the fraud extended. I drove through downtown Cedar Falls in early morning silence, past the hardware store where Uncle Bob had maintained credit accounts for decades, past the bank where he'd secured business loans that built Mitchell family construction into a cornerstone of the local economy. The familiar streets felt different now, like I was seeing them through the lens of someone who'd discovered that their entire understanding of reality had been carefully orchestrated by people they trusted completely. Mr. Harrison's office occupied the third floor of a converted historical building, filled with law books and case files that spoke to decades of legal practice in small-town Ohio. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above stacks of documents spread across his conference table. When I arrived, he was studying papers with the concentration of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle, occasionally making notes in margins with a fountain pen that had seen better days. The documents he showed me that morning revealed a level of premeditation that took my breath away. Bank records indicated that Jessica had been researching Uncle Bob's financial accounts for months before his death, making inquiries about estate procedures and inheritance laws through channels that should never have given her access to confidential information. Credit reports showed unauthorized attempts to verify Uncle Bob's assets and liabilities, requests that had been filed using forged authorization documents bearing his signature. Even more disturbing were email communications between David and someone identified only as a consultant, discussing strategies for expediting estate settlement and avoiding probate complications. The messages referenced Uncle Bob's illness in clinical terms, calculating how his declining health might affect his legal capacity to make binding decisions. They discussed timeline considerations, optimal moments for implementing their plan, contingency measures for handling unexpected resistance from other family members. Mr. Harrison had obtained these records through a court order filed late Friday afternoon, part of the formal fraud investigation that was now moving through legal channels with surprising speed. The judge assigned to the case had apparently seen similar inheritance schemes before and understood the urgency of preventing asset transfers before legitimate ownership could be established. Emergency injunctions had been filed to freeze all estate-related transactions pending resolution of the authenticity questions. But the most shocking revelation came in a folder marked with Aunt Patricia's name. Financial records showed that she had taken out a significant loan against her own property just 3 weeks before Uncle Bob's death, apparently confident that inheritance money would be available to cover the debt. Credit card statements revealed expensive purchases made during Uncle Bob's final days hospitalization, items charged with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how much money would soon be available. The coordination required for this level of financial planning meant they had been working together for months, possibly years, to position themselves for Uncle Bob's death. While I sat beside his hospital bed reading construction magazines aloud and helping him stay connected to the business he loved, they had been calculating asset values and researching legal loopholes that would allow them to steal everything he'd worked to build. Mr. Harrison spread additional documents across the table, his expression growing darker as he explained what investigators had discovered about Jennifer Collins and her supposed law firm. Collins and Associates existed as a legitimate business entity, but Jennifer Collins herself had been employed there for less than 6 months and had no prior experience handling estate law. Her previous work involved real estate transactions and small claims disputes, nothing that would qualify her to manage complex inheritance cases. More importantly, the lease agreement for Collins and Associates office space had been signed by someone using David's credit information, creating a direct financial connection between my brother and the law firm that had presented the false will. Telephone records showed extensive communication between David's cell phone and the Collins and Associates office number during the weeks leading up to Uncle Bob's death, conversations that occurred during business hours when legitimate legal consultations would normally take place. The picture emerging from these documents was far more sophisticated than simple greed or opportunistic theft. This had been a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving multiple participants, forged documents, and a fake legal entity created specifically to legitimize the theft of Uncle Bob's estate. They had researched inheritance law, studied estate fraud techniques, and developed a comprehensive plan designed to steal everything while making their victims grateful for the crumbs they were allowed to keep. I found myself thinking about the funeral service, remembering how they had positioned themselves as grieving family members while secretly celebrating the successful implementation of their fraud scheme. Their tears had been performances, their condolences had been cover stories, their expressions of loss had masked excitement about stolen wealth they were already planning to spend. Even their attendance at the funeral had been calculated, establishing their presence as concerned relatives who deserved inheritance consideration. Mr. Harrison continued explaining the legal implications of what investigators had uncovered. Federal authorities were now involved because the fraud crossed state lines when forged documents were transmitted electronically between Ohio and contacts in other states. Bank fraud charges were possible because unauthorized access to Uncle Bob's financial information had been used to facilitate the scheme. Wire fraud charges were likely because electronic communications had been used to coordinate the conspiracy. The scope of potential criminal charges meant that this would no longer be simply a civil dispute about inheritance distribution. My family members were now facing federal investigation for organized fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. The inheritance money they had been celebrating would be frozen indefinitely, while prosecutors built cases that could result in prison sentences rather than just financial penalties. I asked Mr. Harrison about timeline for resolving the legitimate inheritance claims, understanding that my primary concern remained ensuring that Uncle Bob's actual wishes were honored and that Mitchell Family Construction could continue operating. He explained that criminal investigations often took precedence over civil proceedings, meaning that estate settlement might be delayed for months or even years while federal prosecutors pursued charges against the conspirators. However, he had filed emergency motions requesting immediate restoration of business operations under court supervision, arguing that delay would cause irreparable harm to employees and clients who had no involvement in the fraud scheme. The judge had indicated willingness to consider temporary arrangements that would allow the construction company to continue operating while ownership questions were resolved, preventing innocent people from suffering consequences for crimes they hadn't committed. The afternoon brought a series of phone calls that demonstrated how quickly news travels in small communities when legal scandals involve prominent local families. Maria Santos called from the construction company office to report that clients were asking questions about project delays and schedule changes, apparently aware that something significant was happening with the business ownership. Several employees had heard rumors about inheritance disputes and were worried about job security during the legal proceedings. I spent an hour on the phone with our largest client, a family building a custom home, who had paid a substantial deposit and expected construction to begin within 2 weeks. They had heard fragments of information about estate complications and wanted assurance that their project would be completed as contracted. Explaining the situation without revealing details about ongoing criminal investigations required careful balancing between honesty and discretion. Tom Murphy, my landlord and the bakery owner downstairs, knocked on my apartment door that evening to ask if everything was okay. He had seen multiple police vehicles at the construction company office during the afternoon and was concerned about potential problems affecting the business that employed several of his regular customers. His genuine worry reminded me how many people in Cedar Falls had connections to Mitchell Family Construction beyond simple commercial relationships. The company wasn't just Uncle Bob's legacy or my career foundation, it was woven into the economic fabric of the community, providing jobs that supported families, services that maintained local infrastructure, and business relationships that connected dozens of other local enterprises. The fraud scheme threatened all of these connections, potentially destroying economic relations relationships that had been built over decades of honest work and reliable service. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors to my apartment. Jessica and David arrived together, dressed casually but carrying themselves with the tension of people preparing for confrontation. They had apparently learned about the court proceedings and wanted to discuss what they called misunderstandings about Uncle Bob's estate wishes. Their approach was carefully calibrated, mixing family concern with subtle intimidation designed to discourage me from pursuing legal challenges. Jessica spoke first, her voice carrying the same syrupy sweetness she had used at the funeral, explaining that she understood my disappointment about the inheritance but hoped I wouldn't let legal complications destroy family relationships. She emphasized how much Uncle Bob had valued family harmony and suggested that he would be heartbroken to see us fighting over money when we should be supporting each other through grief. David's approach was more direct, questioning whether I fully understood the costs and complications involved in contesting wills through court proceedings. He mentioned specific dollar amounts for legal fees, timeline estimates for resolution that stretched into years, and statistical information about the low success rates for inheritance challenges. His tone suggested helpful concern, but his message was clear: pursuing legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. They both emphasized their willingness to share inheritance amounts more equitably, suggesting that the will reading had been just a starting point for family discussions about fair distribution. Jessica offered to increase my bequest significantly, while David mentioned possibilities for involving me in decisions about the construction company's future operations. Their sudden generosity revealed how seriously they were taking the legal threats to their stolen inheritance. I listened to their presentation without responding, studying their faces and body language for signs of the people I thought I knew. Jessica's smile looked exactly the same as it had during childhood, the expression she wore when trying to convince our parents that broken household items weren't her fault. David's earnest tone was identical to the voice he used when explaining why he needed to borrow money for various get-rich-quick schemes that never quite worked out as promised. The realization that they had been practicing these same deceptive techniques for decades, perfecting their ability to manipulate family members through false sincerity and manufactured concern, added another layer of betrayal to an already overwhelming situation. They weren't just stealing Uncle Bob's estate, they were using manipulation skills developed over years of family interactions to convince me that accepting their fraud was in my own best interests. When I finally spoke, I kept my response brief and non-committal, thanking them for their concern, while explaining that legal proceedings were now beyond my direct control. I mentioned that federal authorities were involved in investigating potential crimes related to estate fraud, making it impossible for family members to resolve disputed inheritance claims through private negotiations. Their reactions to this information told me everything I needed to know about their awareness of the criminal aspects of their scheme. Jessica's face went pale, and she began asking specific questions about what federal authorities had been told and what evidence they might be examining. David became agitated, demanding to know why I had involved outside investigators instead of trying to resolve family disputes privately. Their responses confirmed that they understood exactly what crimes they had committed and were primarily concerned about avoiding prosecution rather than making amends for the fraud they had perpetrated. The family members who had celebrated stealing my inheritance were now terrified about facing consequences for their criminal behavior. After they left, I sat in my apartment trying to process the emotional complexity of discovering that people you've loved your entire life are capable of such calculated cruelty. The grief I felt wasn't just about losing Uncle Bob or nearly losing his legacy. It was about losing my understanding of who my family members actually were beneath the personas they had maintained for years. That evening, I drove to Uncle Bob's farmhouse one final time before legal proceedings would prevent access to the property. The place looked exactly the same from the outside, but knowing that Jessica had been planning to claim it through fraud changed how everything felt. The workshop where Uncle Bob had taught me carpentry skills, the kitchen where we had discussed business strategies, the porch where we had watched sunsets while talking about life lessons, all of it had been under threat from people who saw only dollar values, where Uncle Bob and I had built memories and meaning. I used my key to enter the workshop, surrounded by tools and equipment that represented 4 decades of honest craftsmanship. Uncle Bob's workbench still held projects he had been completing during his final weeks, pieces of custom cabinetry, finished with the precision and attention to detail that had made Mitchell family construction reputation synonymous with quality work. His tool organization system remained exactly as he had left it, every item in its designated place, ready for work that would never be completed. In the corner of the workshop, I found something that made Uncle Bob's final words about foundations suddenly make perfect sense. Hidden behind a stack of lumber was a fireproof safe I had never noticed before, secured with a combination lock that used numbers I recognized immediately, the date Mitchell family construction had been established. Inside the safe were documents that Uncle Bob had apparently prepared specifically for this situation, evidence that demonstrated his awareness of his family's intentions and his determination to protect what he had built. The documents included detailed financial records showing unauthorized inquiries into his accounts, copies of emails he had intercepted between family members discussing estate planning, and recordings of telephone conversations where they had discussed strategies for expediting his death through medical neglect. Uncle Bob had been conducting his own investigation into their conspiracy, gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of being an unsuspecting victim. Most importantly, the safe contained a second letter addressed to me, dated just 1 week before his death. His handwriting was shakier than usual, reflecting the physical toll of his illness, but his words were clear and decisive. "Sarah," he had written by now, "you know they tried to steal everything we built together, but I want you to understand that this isn't really about money or property. This is about people who never learned the difference between earning something and taking it." The letter continued with specific instructions for rebuilding Mitchell family construction after the legal proceedings concluded, including contacts for clients who would provide references, suppliers who would extend credit, and skilled workers who would return when legitimate leadership was restored. Uncle Bob had been planning not just to protect his estate from fraud, but to ensure that his life's work could continue, even if his death triggered temporary disruption. Standing in that workshop, surrounded by evidence of Uncle Bob's foresight and preparation, I finally understood what he had been trying to tell me about foundations and rebuilding. The visible structures might be damaged or destroyed by people who didn't understand their value, but the real foundation, relationships, reputation, skills, and integrity, couldn't be stolen through forged documents or false legal proceedings. My family had tried to destroy everything Uncle Bob had built, but they had only succeeded in revealing their own moral bankruptcy while strengthening my resolve to honor his legacy through honest work and ethical behavior. They had stolen money that would eventually be recovered through legal proceedings, but they had lost something far more valuable, their place in the community. Uncle Bob had spent decades serving with distinction. The battle for justice was just beginning, but I was no longer fighting alone. Uncle Bob had provided the evidence, the legal foundation, and the strategic planning necessary to ensure that truth would eventually prevail over fraud. All I had to do was trust his preparation and follow the path he had carefully constructed through 4 decades of building strong foundations that could withstand any attack. Parts 1014, Justice and Resolution. Monday morning brought Thomas Bradley to my apartment door, carrying a briefcase that would change everything about how this story ended. His appearance was unremarkable, medium height, graying hair, wearing a navy suit that had seen better days, but something in his eyes suggested someone accustomed to delivering news that altered people's lives permanently. He introduced himself as the court-appointed executor of Uncle Bob's sealed estate, authorized to implement the authentic will, now that federal investigators had confirmed the fraud scheme's scope and complexity. Bradley's presence represented the culmination of legal proceedings that had been moving through various court systems, while I struggled to understand how deeply my family's betrayal extended. His briefcase contained documents that would restore Uncle Bob's actual wishes, while simultaneously destroying every assumption my family had made about their stolen inheritance. Federal authorities authorities had completed their investigation faster than anyone expected, apparently motivated by the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme and its potential implications for other inheritance cases. The authentic will that Mr. Bradley presented looked nothing like the document Jennifer Collins had read at her fake law firm. Uncle Bob's actual intentions were detailed across 12 pages of legal language that had been prepared with extraordinary care to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation my family had attempted. Every clause had been written to anticipate potential challenges, every bequest had been structured to minimize opportunities for contest or delay, every instruction had been crafted to ensure rapid implementation once authenticity was established. According to the real will, I inherited 73% of Uncle Bob's total estate, including Mitchell family construction, the farmhouse, and its acreage, investment accounts worth nearly $400,000, and a trust fund established specifically to ensure business continuity during ownership transition. The percentage was deliberately calculated to provide controlling interest, while leaving modest bequests for other family members, assuming they hadn't forfeited their inheritance through criminal behavior. But the document included clauses that Uncle Bob had apparently added specifically because he anticipated fraud attempts by certain family members. Anyone who participated in falsifying estate documents, presenting forged wills, or attempting to steal inheritance through deceptive means would forfeit all claims to any portion of his estate. Their bequests would be redistributed to legitimate beneficiaries or donated to charitable organizations that Uncle Bob had supported throughout his life. Mr. Bradley explained these provisions with the measured tone of someone who had seen similar family betrayal destroy relationships across multiple generations. Uncle Bob had consulted with legal
experts who specialized in estate protection, learning from cases where grieving families had been torn apart by relatives who viewed death as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than a time for honoring memory and legacy. The forfeiture clauses meant that Jessica, David, Aunt Patricia, and Cousin Mark would receive nothing from Uncle Bob's estate. Worse, they would be required to repay any stolen funds they had spent based on the false inheritance claims, with interest and penalties calculated from the date of Uncle Bob's death. The yacht Mitchell had bragged about, the expensive vacation Aunt Patricia had taken, the crypto investments David had made, all of it would need to be liquidated to satisfy restitution requirements. But Uncle Bob's planning had extended beyond simple asset protection. The authentic will included detailed instructions for rebuilding Mitchell family construction's reputation after the scandal, specific strategies for retaining employees during the transition period, and financial provisions for completing contracted projects without interruption. He had anticipated that legal proceedings might temporarily disrupt business operations and had created mechanisms to minimize damage to innocent clients and workers. Mr. Bradley handed me a sealed envelope that Uncle Bob had requested be delivered personally once the authentic will was implemented. Inside was a letter that felt like receiving final advice from someone who understood exactly what challenges lay ahead. Sarah, he had written, if you're reading this, it means the legal system worked the way it's supposed to work. Justice took time, but it arrived eventually. Now you need to decide what kind of person you want to be with the power you've inherited. The letter continued with specific guidance about managing the inheritance responsibly, using the construction business to benefit the Cedar Falls community, and maintaining the ethical standards that had made the Mitchell name synonymous with honest work and fair dealing. Uncle Bob emphasized that wealth and power were tools that could build or destroy depending on the character of the person wielding them. He trusted me to use both wisely because I had already demonstrated those qualities during our years working together. Most importantly, the letter addressed the emotional complexity of dealing with family members who had betrayed trust so completely. Uncle Bob wrote about forgiveness not as something owed to people who had caused harm, but as something chosen by people who refused to let others' moral failures define their own character. He suggested that the most powerful response to betrayal was living well, building something meaningful, and proving through behavior that integrity was more valuable than stolen money. The morning after Mr. Bradley's visit brought a series of phone calls that demonstrated how quickly news travels when federal authorities arrest people for inheritance fraud. Jessica was taken into custody at her workplace, a humiliating scene that her colleagues would remember long after legal proceedings concluded. David was arrested at his apartment, apparently while attempting to transfer remaining stolen funds to offshore accounts that investigators had been monitoring for weeks. Aunt Patricia and Cousin Mark were charged as co-conspirators, their involvement documented through electronic communications and financial records that federal prosecutors had been analyzing since the investigation began. The sophisticated nature of their fraud scheme had attracted attention from authorities who specialized in complex white-collar crimes, ensuring that prosecution would be thorough and penalties would reflect the organized nature of their criminal behavior. Local news coverage of the arrests focused on the betrayal of family trust rather than simply the financial crimes involved. Cedar Falls was a community where family relationships mattered, where people understood the difference between earning inheritance through love and respect versus stealing it through fraud and manipulation. The story resonated with residents who had their own experiences with relatives who viewed family connections as opportunities for personal gain. Maria Santos called from the construction company office to report that clients were expressing support for my leadership transition and confidence in the business continuity under legitimate ownership. Several clients who had heard about the fraud investigation wanted to increase their project scope, apparently viewing their continued business relationship as a way to demonstrate community support for honest practices over criminal behavior. The employees at Mitchell Family Construction responded to news of the ownership resolution with relief that surprised me with its intensity. Several workers had been worried about losing jobs they had held for years, concerned that estate complications might force business closure regardless of who ultimately inherited control. Learning that Uncle Bob had planned specifically to protect their employment during legal proceedings reinforced their loyalty to the company and their respect for his character. Within 2 weeks of the authentic will's implementation, Mitchell Family Construction was operating more efficiently than it had during the months of uncertainty following Uncle Bob's death. Workers who had been distracted by job security concerns refocused on project quality and customer service. Clients who had been hesitant to commit to long-term contracts began planning major renovations and new construction projects. Suppliers who had been requiring cash payments due to ownership uncertainty restored normal credit terms. The business growth that followed Uncle Bob's estate resolution felt like vindication of his belief that honest work and ethical behavior would ultimately prevail over fraud and manipulation. The community responded to the scandal not by avoiding Mitchell Family Construction but by increasing their support for a business that had been targeted by criminals who didn't understand the difference between stealing money and earning respect. But the most significant change was personal rather than professional. The inheritance that Uncle Bob had left me wasn't just financial assets or business ownership, it was freedom from people who had spent years manipulating family relationships for personal advantage, permission to build a life based on authentic values rather than toxic family dynamics, and the understanding that blood relationships meant nothing without mutual respect and genuine affection. I moved from my apartment above Murphy's Bakery to Uncle Bob's farmhouse on Riverside Road, not because I needed more space, but because the house represented everything positive about his legacy. The workshop where he had taught me carpentry skills became my retreat for processing the emotional complexity of the past months. The kitchen where we had discussed business strategies became the place where I planned expansion of Mitchell Family Construction into new markets and services. The porch where we had watched sunsets while talking about life lessons became my favorite spot for evening reflection about how dramatically my understanding of family loyalty and justice had evolved. Uncle Bob had been right about foundations being more important than visible structures. The legal system had restored his authentic wishes, but the real foundation, integrity, work ethic, and genuine care for others had never been threatened by my family's criminal behavior. 6 months after the fraud investigation concluded, I received a letter from Jessica written from the federal correctional facility where she was serving her sentence for inheritance fraud.
The letter was filled with self-pity and resentment, blaming Uncle Bob for creating legal complications that had destroyed her life, blaming me for pursuing criminal charges instead of accepting family reconciliation, blaming the legal system for punishing what she characterized as a simple misunderstanding about estate distribution. Nothing in her letter suggested understanding that she had committed serious crimes or remorse for the harm she had caused to multiple people. Her primary concern remained the inconvenience of facing consequences for criminal behavior rather than any acknowledgement of the moral failures that had led to federal prosecution. The letter confirmed that Uncle Bob had been correct in anticipating that certain family members would never accept responsibility for their choices or learn from their mistakes. I didn't respond to Jessica's letter just as I hadn't responded to similar communications from David and Aunt Patricia. Uncle Bob had taught me that some relationships couldn't be repaired because they had never been based on mutual respect in the first place. The family members who had tried to steal his legacy had revealed their true character under pressure, and that character included willingness to betray trust, commit fraud, and blame others for consequences of their own criminal behavior. Instead of dwelling on family relationships that had been built on deception, I focused on building new relationships based on authentic shared values. The construction industry in Cedar Falls included dozens of honest business owners who had known Uncle Bob for decades and were willing to mentor his successor. Community organizations that Uncle Bob had supported welcomed my continued involvement and leadership. Church groups, charitable foundations, and local government entities provided opportunities to honor his legacy through service rather than simply through business success. The most meaningful new relationship developed with Tom Murphy, the bakery owner who had been my landlord during the difficult months following Uncle Bob's death. His concern for my welfare during the legal proceedings had been genuine, based on real care for someone facing challenging circumstances rather than opportunistic interest in potential financial benefit. When I offered to help him expand his bakery business using construction expertise and investment capital, our business partnership grew into a friendship that reminded me what healthy relationships actually looked like. A year after Uncle Bob's death, Mitchell Family Construction had grown to employ 23 people and had expanded services to include commercial renovation projects throughout Central Ohio. The business success felt meaningful because it honored Uncle Bob's vision while providing good jobs for skilled workers and valuable services for clients who appreciated quality craftsmanship. But the personal success felt even more meaningful because it represented freedom from people who had tried to steal both my inheritance and my peace of mind. The farmhouse on Riverside Road became a gathering place for genuine relationships rather than toxic family obligations. Sunday dinners included employees from the construction company and their families, clients who had become friends, community members who shared interests in building rather than destroying. The kitchen that had once been filled with tension during forced family gatherings became filled with laughter from people who enjoyed each other's company without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Uncle Bob's workshop became a teaching space where I passed on carpentry skills to young people in Cedar Falls who wanted to learn trades that could provide stable careers and personal satisfaction. The tools he had used for 4 decades continued serving their purpose under new hands, connecting another generation to the values of honest work and attention to detail that had made his reputation synonymous with excellence. The evening routine that Uncle Bob and I had shared continued in modified form, with me sitting on the porch during sunsets reflecting on lessons learned and progress made. But instead of discussing business strategies or construction projects, I found myself thinking about the difference between relatives and family, between inheritance and legacy, between justice and revenge. The legal system had provided justice by prosecuting criminals and restoring stolen assets to their rightful owner. But the real victory had been learning to distinguish between people who deserved trust and people who had simply been granted access through accidents of birth. Uncle Bob's final gift hadn't been money or property. It had been permission to choose my own family based on character rather than genetics, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and to understand that the most powerful response to betrayal was refusing to become bitter or cynical about human nature. The story that began with family members celebrating stolen inheritance ended with understanding that real wealth couldn't be stolen through forged documents or criminal schemes. Uncle Bob had left me financial assets that provided security and opportunity, but he had also left me wisdom about building strong foundations that could withstand any attack from people who mistook cruelty for cleverness and fraud for intelligence. 3 years later, when people in Cedar Falls asked about the inheritance scandal that had shocked the community, I could honestly say that it had been one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Not because I enjoyed being betrayed by family members or fighting legal battles to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but because it had taught me lessons about integrity, resilience, and the importance of choosing relationships carefully that would serve me well for the rest of my life. Uncle Bob had been right about foundations being more important than visible structures. The family members who had tried to destroy everything he had built had only succeeded in revealing their own moral poverty while strengthening my appreciation for the values that made life meaningful. They had stolen money that was eventually recovered through legal proceedings, but they had lost something far more valuable: their place in a community that valued honesty over cleverness and character over convenience. The inheritance fraud that they had planned so carefully had backfired completely, costing them their freedom, their reputations, and their relationships with the only family member who might have forgiven earlier mistakes if they had chosen redemption over criminal behavior. They had gambled everything on a scheme that was doomed to fail because they had never understood that Uncle Bob was always several steps ahead of people who underestimated his intelligence and preparation. Looking back, the most remarkable aspect of the entire experience was how completely Uncle Bob had anticipated every element of their betrayal and prepared countermeasures that ensured justice would prevail regardless of how sophisticated their fraud scheme appeared to be. He had built legal foundations as carefully as he had built construction projects, with attention to detail and quality materials that could withstand pressure from people who didn't understand the difference between earning something and taking it. The final lesson was perhaps the most important: that living well truly was the best revenge against people who had tried to steal both inheritance and peace of mind. While my family members served prison sentences and struggled with restitution payments that would follow them for years, I was building something meaningful with the legacy Uncle Bob had protected so carefully. The contrast between their circumstances and mine served as a daily reminder that character was indeed more valuable than money, and that integrity was indeed its own reward. The hidden clause that Thomas Bradley revealed that morning would forever change how I understood Uncle Bob's final strategy for protecting everything he'd built over 4 decades in Cedar Falls. As he spread the additional documents across my kitchen table, sunlight streaming through windows that Uncle Bob had installed himself, I realized that the inheritance fraud my family had attempted was only the beginning of a much larger story about justice, redemption, and the true meaning of legacy. The clause itself was buried on page 9 of Uncle Bob's authentic will, written in language so precise that it could only have been crafted by someone who understood exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. Any beneficiary who attempts to defraud, manipulate, or steal from this estate shall forfeit all claims to inheritance and shall be required to provide restitution equal to 3 times the value of assets they attempted to unlawfully obtain, plus legal fees and court costs incurred in prosecuting their criminal behavior. But the clause included additional provisions that went far beyond simple financial penalties. Uncle Bob had established a charitable foundation in my name, funded with assets that would have gone to Jessica, David, Aunt Patricia, and Cousin Mark if they hadn't revealed their true character through criminal behavior. The foundation's mission was to provide educational scholarships for young people in Cedar Falls who demonstrated integrity, work ethic, and commitment to serving their community through honest labor. Mr. Bradley explained that Uncle Bob had spent months researching similar inheritance protection strategies, consulting with legal experts who specialized in preventing estate fraud, and learning from cases where families had been destroyed by relatives who viewed death as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The charitable foundation wasn't just punishment for my family's criminal behavior, it was Uncle Bob's way of ensuring that their attempted theft would ultimately benefit deserving young people who embodied the values he had tried to instill in his own relatives. The foundation would be administered jointly by myself and a board of community leaders who had known Uncle Bob for decades, ensuring that scholarship decisions would be based on merit rather than personal favoritism. Recipients would be selected based on academic achievement, community service, and demonstrated commitment to careers in skilled trades, construction, or other industries that built rather than destroyed. The annual awards ceremony would be held at the high school where Uncle Bob had spoken to students about the dignity of honest work and the importance of building strong foundations in both construction and character. Beyond the charitable foundation, Uncle Bob's will included provisions that I hadn't expected, demonstrating the depth of his planning and his understanding of what would be required to rebuild Mitchell Family Construction's reputation after the scandal. He had pre-negotiated contracts with 3 major suppliers in Columbus, ensuring that the business would have access to materials and equipment regardless of any temporary disruption caused by legal proceedings. He had secured letters of recommendation from clients and competitors throughout Central Ohio, testimonials that could be used to restore confidence in the company's reliability and professionalism. Most remarkably, Uncle Bob had established relationships with skilled craftsmen in neighboring towns who were prepared to relocate to Cedar Falls if Mitchell Family Construction needed to rebuild its workforce after the inheritance fraud became public knowledge. These weren't just employment agreements. They were commitments from master carpenters, electricians, and plumbers who respected Uncle Bob's reputation and wanted to ensure that his business legacy would survive whatever damage his family members might cause through their criminal behavior. Mr. Bradley handed me a folder containing correspondence between Uncle Bob and business leaders throughout Ohio, letters that revealed the extent of his professional network and the depth of respect he had earned over 4 decades of honest dealing. Construction company owners who competed with Mitchell Family Construction had written to express their willingness to provide references, share resources, and collaborate on projects if Uncle Bob's death resulted in temporary business disruption. The letters painted a picture of a man who had built more than a successful company. He had built relationships based on mutual respect, professional integrity, and genuine concern for the welfare of everyone involved in the construction industry. Competitors had become allies because Uncle Bob had consistently chosen collaboration over cutthroat business practices, fair dealing over short-term profit maximization, and community benefit over personal advantage. Reading through these documents, I began to understand why Uncle Bob had been so confident that his business legacy would survive whatever my family attempted to do through fraud and manipulation. He hadn't just built a company. He had built a network of relationships that transcended individual businesses or personalities, a community of professionals who shared common values and would support each other during difficult circumstances. The practical implications of Uncle Bob's planning became clear over the following weeks as Mitchell Family Construction transitioned from the uncertainty of legal proceedings to the stability of legitimate ownership. Suppliers who had been requiring cash payments during the estate dispute immediately restored normal credit terms. Clients who had been hesitant to commit to long-term projects began planning major renovations and new construction. Workers who had been worried about job security refocused their energy on productivity and customer service. But the most significant development was the response from the broader construction community throughout Central Ohio. Company owners who had known Uncle Bob began referring clients to Mitchell Family Construction not out of charity or sympathy, but because they understood that the business had maintained the same standards of quality and reliability that had made Uncle Bob's reputation synonymous with excellence in craftsmanship. Within 3 months of the Authentic Wills implementation, Mitchell Family Construction had more work contracted than the company had handled in any comparable period during Uncle Bob's lifetime. Increase wasn't just quantity but quality, with clients specifically requesting the company for high-end residential projects and commercial renovations that required sophisticated planning and execution. The business was thriving not despite the inheritance scandal but because the scandal had clarified exactly what values the company represented and attracted clients who appreciated those values. The growth required hiring additional skilled workers, expanding equipment inventory, and developing new systems for managing complex projects across multiple locations. Each challenge became an opportunity to implement improvements that Uncle Bob had discussed but hadn't had time to develop before his illness began. The business expansion felt like honoring his vision while adapting his strategies to contemporary market conditions and client expectations. Maria Santos, our office manager, emerged as an invaluable partner in managing the business growth. Her institutional knowledge of client relationships, supplier contracts, and employee capabilities provided continuity during the ownership transition, while her enthusiasm for professional development helped implement new technologies and procedures that improved efficiency and customer service. She had learned Uncle Bob's commitment to treating every employee as a valued team member rather than just a source of labor, and she helped me maintain that culture while adapting to larger-scale operations. The charitable foundation that Uncle Bob had established began accepting scholarship applications 6 months after the will was implemented. The response from high school students throughout Cedar Falls exceeded our expectations, with applications demonstrating exactly the kind of character and commitment that Uncle Bob had hoped to encourage. Young people wrote about their plans to become electricians, carpenters, plumbers, and small business owners, careers that would contribute to their community's economic health while providing personal satisfaction through meaningful work. The first scholarship recipients were honored at a ceremony held in Uncle Bob's memory, with community leaders speaking about his contributions to Cedar Falls and his commitment to helping young people understand the dignity of skilled labor. The recipients themselves spoke about their career goals and their appreciation for educational opportunities that would help them develop expertise in trades that had built the community where they lived. Listening to those young people talk about their dreams and aspirations, I felt Uncle Bob's presence in a way that was more powerful than grief or memory. His legacy wasn't just the business he had built or the money he had left behind. It was the continuation of values that would influence people he would never meet, inspiring them to build rather than destroy, to create rather than steal, to contribute rather than consume. The contrast between the scholarship recipients and my family members who were serving prison sentences for inheritance fraud couldn't have been more stark. The young people receiving Uncle Bob's financial support were planning careers that would benefit their community for decades to come. The relatives who had tried to steal his legacy were learning that criminal behavior had consequences that extended far beyond financial penalties, affecting their reputations, their relationships, and their future opportunities in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Jessica's attempts to contact me from federal prison continued periodically, with letters that alternated between self-pity and manipulation, never acknowledging the criminal nature of her behavior or expressing genuine remorse for the harm she had caused. Her communications reinforced my understanding that Uncle Bob had been correct in anticipating that certain family members would never accept responsibility for their choices or learn from their mistakes. David's situation was more complicated because his involvement in the fraud scheme had included identity theft and financial crimes that carried longer sentences and more severe restitution requirements. His attempts to minimize his culpability by blaming other family members for leading him into criminal behavior demonstrated the same lack of personal responsibility that had made the fraud scheme possible in the first place. Aunt Patricia's letters were filled with complaints about prison conditions and demands that I use my inheritance to provide financial support for her legal appeals, apparently believing that family loyalty required me to help her escape consequences for crimes she had committed against Uncle Bob's estate. Her inability to understand why I wouldn't assist someone who had tried to steal my inheritance revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement and her fundamental misunderstanding of what family relationships should involve. Cousin Mark had received the lightest sentence due to his limited role in the fraud scheme, but his communications suggested that he viewed his criminal conviction as simply bad luck rather than the natural consequence of choosing to participate in stealing from relatives. His focus remained on minimizing the impact of his criminal record on his future employment prospects rather than on making amends for the harm he had caused or
developing better judgment about ethical behavior. The psychological pattern that emerged from their communications was consistent. None of them accepted responsibility for their criminal behavior. None of them expressed genuine remorse for the harm they had caused. And none of them demonstrated any understanding of why their actions had been morally wrong, rather than simply legally risky. They remained focused on their own inconvenience rather than on the damage they had inflicted on Uncle Bob's memory, my emotional well-being, and the community's trust in family relationships. Their continued self-centeredness reinforced my decision to build new relationships based on shared values rather than genetic connections. The construction workers, clients, and community members who became my chosen family demonstrated daily that authentic relationships were built on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's welfare. These relationships provided the emotional support and practical assistance that healthy families should offer, without the manipulation and hidden agendas that had characterized my interactions with genetic relatives. 2 years after Uncle Bob's death, I married Tom Murphy in a ceremony held at the farmhouse on Riverside Road, surrounded by people who had become family through choice rather than accident of birth. The guest list included construction workers and their families, clients who had become friends, scholarship recipients who had become mentors to younger students, and community leaders who had supported both the business and the charitable foundation. Uncle Bob would have approved of Tom, not because he was financially successful or socially prominent, but because he was honest, hardworking, and genuinely caring toward people who needed help. Their values were identical despite their different backgrounds, and their approach to business was based on the same principles of fair dealing and community service that had made Uncle Bob's reputation synonymous with integrity. The wedding reception included presentations from scholarship recipients who had completed their education and were beginning careers in skilled trades throughout Central Ohio. Their success stories demonstrated the continuing impact of Uncle Bob's legacy, showing how his commitment to education and honest work was influencing people who would carry those values forward to another generation. The farmhouse that had been threatened by Jessica's fraud scheme became the center of a new kind of family, one based on shared values rather than shared genetics. Sunday dinners included whoever needed community that week, whether longtime friends or new acquaintances who were dealing with difficult circumstances and needed the support that healthy families provide. The kitchen that had once been filled with tension due to forced family gatherings became filled with laughter from people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Uncle Bob's workshop became a teaching space where Tom and I passed on carpentry skills to young people who wanted to learn trades that could provide stable careers and personal satisfaction. The tools that Uncle Bob had used for 4 decades continued serving their purpose under new hands, connecting another generation to the values of honest work and attention to detail that had made his reputation synonymous with excellence. Mitchell Family Construction grew to employ 37 people and expanded services to include historic restoration projects throughout Central Ohio. The business success felt meaningful because it honored Uncle Bob's vision while providing good jobs for skilled workers and valuable services for clients who appreciated quality craftsmanship. But the personal success felt even more meaningful because it represented freedom from people who had tried to steal both inheritance and peace of mind. The charitable foundation established annual awards that became prestigious recognition throughout Central Ohio, with recipients going on to successful careers that contributed to their community's economic health and social stability. The foundation's impact extended beyond individual scholarships to influence how young people throughout the region thought about career choices and community service. 5 years after the inheritance fraud investigation concluded, I received notification that Jessica was being released from federal prison and wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss family reconciliation and possible financial assistance. Her letter suggested that she had learned important lessons during her incarceration and was prepared to rebuild relationships based on mutual respect and genuine family affection. I didn't respond to her letter, just as I hadn't responded to similar communications from other family members over the years. Uncle Bob had taught me that some relationships couldn't be repaired because they had never been based on authentic values in the first place. The family members who had tried to steal his legacy had revealed their true character under pressure, and that character included willingness to betray trust, commit fraud, and blame others for consequences of their own criminal behavior. Instead of dwelling on relationships that had been built on manipulation and deception, I continued focusing on relationships that were built on mutual respect and shared values. The construction industry, the community organizations, and the charitable foundation provided numerous opportunities to work with people who shared Uncle Bob's commitment to building rather than destroying, creating rather than stealing, contributing rather than consuming. The most profound realization was that Uncle Bob's final gift hadn't been money or property, or even protection from family members who had tried to steal my inheritance. His final gift had been wisdom about the difference between genetic relatives and chosen family, between obligation and genuine affection, between inherited wealth and earned respect. Looking back on the inheritance fraud that had seemed so devastating when it first occurred, I could honestly say that it had been one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Not because I enjoyed being betrayed by family members or fighting legal battles to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but because it had taught me lessons about integrity, resilience, and the importance of choosing relationships carefully that would serve me well for the rest of my life. The hidden clause that had seemed like Uncle Bob's final surprise had actually been his first lesson in a curriculum about building strong foundations that could withstand any attack from people who mistook cruelty for cleverness and fraud for intelligence. The legal protection he had provided was just the beginning of an education about values, relationships, and the true meaning of family that would continue influencing my decisions for decades to come. Uncle Bob had been right about foundations being more important than visible structures. The family members who had tried to destroy everything he had built had only succeeded in revealing their own moral bankruptcy while strengthening my appreciation for the values that made life meaningful. They had stolen money that was eventually recovered through legal proceedings, but they had lost something far more valuable: their place in a community that valued character over convenience and integrity over immediate gratification. The story that began with family members celebrating stolen inheritance ended with understanding that real wealth couldn't be stolen through forged documents or criminal schemes. Uncle Bob had left me financial assets that provided security and opportunity, but more importantly, he had left me wisdom about building authentic relationships and choosing family members based on character rather than genetics. The inheritance that truly mattered was the knowledge that integrity was its own reward, that honest work provided satisfaction that stolen money could never match, and that the most powerful response to betrayal was building something meaningful rather than seeking revenge against people who had already destroyed themselves through their own poor choices. Years later, when people asked about the inheritance scandal that had shocked Cedar Falls, I could tell them that justice had prevailed not just in the courtroom but in the daily choices that followed the legal resolution. Uncle Bob's legacy lived on not just in the business and foundation that bore his name, but in the values that continued influencing everyone who had learned from his example about the importance of building strong foundations that could withstand any storm. The letter that arrived 7 years after Uncle Bob's death came from an unexpected source and contained information that would forever change how I understood the complete scope of his planning and the true depth of my family's betrayal. The envelope bore the letterhead of Henderson and Associates, a law firm in Columbus that I'd never heard of, but the contents revealed that Uncle Bob had been working with multiple legal teams across Ohio to ensure that every aspect of his estate protection strategy would withstand even the most sophisticated attempts at fraud or manipulation. The senior partner, Elizabeth Henderson, explained in her cover letter that Uncle Bob had engaged their firm specifically to monitor the long-term implementation of his estate plan and to provide additional protections that would activate only after several years had passed. He had anticipated that family members who failed in their initial fraud attempts might try different approaches once they were released from prison or completed their legal obligations, and he had wanted to ensure that my inheritance remained protected indefinitely. According to the documents, Miss Henderson had been authorized to release. Uncle Bob had established what he called a generational trust, designed to benefit not just me, but any children I might have and their descendants for the next century. The trust included assets that hadn't been disclosed in his original will, investments and property holdings that he had acquired specifically to provide long-term financial security for family members who demonstrated the character traits he valued most highly. The hidden assets were substantial enough to fund college educations, business startups, and home purchases for multiple generations, but access to these resources required meeting specific criteria related to integrity, community service, and commitment to honest work. Uncle Bob had essentially created a character test that would continue operating long after his death, ensuring that his wealth would only benefit people who embodied the values he had tried to instill in his own relatives. But the most startling revelation was contained in a sealed section of the trust documents that Miss Henderson had been instructed to open only if certain conditions were met. Inside was evidence that Uncle Bob had discovered my family's fraud conspiracy months before his death and had been working with federal investigators to document their criminal behavior while appearing to be an unsuspecting victim of their manipulation. The evidence included audio recordings of conversations where Jessica, David, and Aunt Patricia discussed specific details of their fraud scheme, believing that Uncle Bob's illness had made him too weak to understand what they were planning. The recordings captured them laughing about his supposed confusion, celebrating their cleverness in manipulating legal documents, and dividing up inheritance money they hadn't yet stolen but considered already theirs. Uncle Bob had been wearing a recording device during family visits for the final 3 months of his life, documenting every conversation where they revealed their criminal intentions. He had also installed hidden cameras in his hospital room and his home, capturing video evidence of them searching through his personal papers, photographing financial documents, and practicing forged signatures when they thought he was sleeping or too medicated to notice their activities. The sophistication of Uncle Bob's counterintelligence operation was breathtaking. While my family believed they were manipulating a dying man who was too ill to protect himself, he had been systematically gathering evidence that would ensure their criminal prosecution and complete legal destruction. Every conversation they thought was private had been recorded, every document they believed they had stolen undetected had been photographed, every plan they considered secret had been documented with meticulous attention to detail. Miss Henderson explained that Uncle Bob had shared this evidence with federal investigators weeks before his death, providing prosecutors with everything they needed to build airtight cases against all participants in the fraud conspiracy. The investigation that had seemed to move so quickly after his death had actually been planned and coordinated months in advance, with Uncle Bob serving as the primary intelligence source for authorities who were already building criminal cases before the fake will reading ever occurred. The realization that Uncle Bob had been protecting me and his legacy through such elaborate planning while simultaneously fighting terminal cancer was overwhelming. He had been enduring chemotherapy treatments, managing severe pain, and dealing with the emotional stress of watching family members reveal their true character, all while maintaining the appearance of being too weak to understand what was happening around him. The documents revealed that Uncle Bob had consulted with retired federal agents who specialized in inheritance fraud cases, learning surveillance techniques and evidence-gathering methods that would ensure prosecutions would be successful, regardless of how sophisticated the fraud scheme appeared to be. He had turned his final months into an elaborate sting operation designed to protect his legacy while exposing the moral bankruptcy of relatives who had forgotten the difference between earning respect and stealing money. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Uncle Bob's planning was his emotional preparation for the betrayal he knew was coming. Miss Henderson included personal notes that Uncle Bob had written during his final weeks, reflections on family relationships, and the painful process of accepting that people he had loved and supported for decades were planning to celebrate his death as an opportunity for personal enrichment. In these notes, Uncle Bob wrote about the difference between biological family and chosen family, between inherited relationships and earned relationships, between the people who deserved his protection and the people who had forfeited their claims to his care through their own moral choices. He had grieved the loss of family relationships while he was still alive, processing the betrayal while he still had time to take protective action. The notes revealed that Uncle Bob's primary concern hadn't been protecting his money from theft, but protecting me from the psychological damage that family betrayal could cause if I wasn't prepared to understand what was happening and why. He had worried that discovering my family's true character after his death might make me bitter, cynical, or unable to trust other people in the future. His solution had been to ensure that the truth would be revealed gradually, through legal processes that would demonstrate not just that justice was possible, but that planning and preparation could triumph over criminal behavior.
He had wanted me to learn that integrity was more powerful than manipulation, that honest relationships were more valuable than stolen money, and that building something meaningful was more satisfying than seeking revenge against people who had already destroyed themselves through their own poor choices. The gradual revelation of Uncle Bob's complete strategy helped me understand why the inheritance restoration had felt less like victory and more like education. Each phase of the legal process had taught specific lessons about character, relationships, and the importance of choosing values over convenience. The scholarship foundation, the business expansion, the community relationships, all of it had been designed to help me build a life based on authentic principles, rather than simply recovering from family betrayal. Miss Henderson's letter included instructions for accessing additional resources that Uncle Bob had established to support my continued personal and professional development. These included connections with business mentors throughout Ohio, educational opportunities for advanced training in construction management and entrepreneurship, and introductions to community leaders who shared his commitment to service and ethical behavior. The mentorship network was particularly impressive, including successful business owners who had agreed to provide guidance and support for Uncle Bob's successor without any expectation of financial return or business advantage. These were people who had respected Uncle Bob's character and wanted to honor his memory by helping ensure that his values would continue influencing the next generation of community leaders. Over the following months, I began working with several of these mentors, learning advanced business strategies and leadership techniques that helped Mitchell family construction grow beyond what Uncle Bob had achieved during his lifetime. But more importantly, I learned how to balance professional success with community service, how to use wealth responsibly, and how to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial advantage. The business expansion that followed included opening a second location in Columbus, specializing in historic restoration projects that required sophisticated craftsmanship and extensive collaboration with preservation specialists and municipal authorities. The Columbus office employed 15 additional craftsmen and generated revenue that funded expanded scholarship programs and community development initiatives throughout Central Ohio. But the most meaningful development was the creation of a training program for young people who wanted to learn construction trades but couldn't afford traditional technical education. The program combined hands-on instruction with academic coursework, providing participants with both practical skills and business knowledge that would help them become successful entrepreneurs rather than just skilled employees. The training program attracted students from throughout Ohio and neighboring states, young people who shared Uncle Bob's values about honest work and community service, but needed opportunities to develop their potential. Graduates of the program went on to start their own construction companies, join established firms as skilled craftsmen, or continue their education in engineering and architecture programs at universities throughout the region. Watching these young people succeed professionally while maintaining the ethical standards that Uncle Bob had taught me confirmed that his legacy was expanding far beyond anything he could have imagined during his lifetime. The values he had embodied were influencing people he had never met, inspiring them to build careers and relationships based on integrity rather than immediate gratification. The contrast between these scholarship recipients and my genetic relatives, who were still dealing with consequences of their criminal behavior, couldn't have been more stark. The young people benefiting from Uncle Bob's generosity were planning careers that would contribute to their communities for decades to come. The family members who had tried to steal his legacy were learning that criminal behavior had consequences that extended far beyond prison sentences, affecting their employment prospects, their housing options, and their relationships in ways that would follow them indefinitely. Jessica's attempts to rebuild her life after prison had been complicated by her criminal record and her inability to accept responsibility for the choices that had led to her conviction. Her letters to me had evolved from self-pity to anger to demands for financial assistance, but never included genuine acknowledgement of the harm she had caused or authentic expressions of remorse for her criminal behavior. David's situation was even more challenging because his role in the fraud scheme had included sophisticated financial crimes that made him unemployable in any position involving money or trust. His attempts to start over in different communities had been undermined by background checks that revealed his federal convictions and his pattern of blaming others for consequences of his own choices. Aunt Patricia had struggled with reintegration after prison because her sense of entitlement remained unchanged despite her criminal conviction. She continued to believe that family loyalty required me to provide financial support for her legal appeals and living expenses, apparently unable to understand why someone would refuse to help relatives who had tried to steal their inheritance. Cousin Mark had completed his sentence and restitution requirements, but his criminal record had limited his employment options, and his relationships had been damaged by his participation in the fraud scheme. His communications suggested that he viewed his conviction as simply bad luck rather than the natural consequence of choosing to participate in criminal behavior. Their collective inability to learn from their mistakes or accept responsibility for their actions reinforced my understanding that Uncle Bob had been correct in anticipating that certain people would never change, regardless of what consequences they faced. The family members who had tried to destroy his legacy remained focused on their own inconvenience rather than on the damage they had inflicted or the lessons they might learn from their experiences. 10 years after Uncle Bob's death, I received an invitation to speak at the annual conference of the Ohio Construction Industry Association about business ethics and family succession planning. The invitation reflected the reputation that Mitchell Family Construction had earned under my leadership, but also the recognition that Uncle Bob's story had important lessons for other business owners who wanted to protect their legacies from relatives who might view inheritance as entitlement rather than responsibility. The speech I gave that day focused on the difference between building wealth and building character, between leaving money to relatives and leaving values to people who would honor them responsibly. I talked about Uncle Bob's planning and preparation, his understanding that protection required more than legal documents, and his commitment to ensuring that his life's work would benefit people who shared his values, rather than people who simply shared his genetics. The response from conference attendees was overwhelming, with business owners throughout Ohio requesting information about estate protection strategies and character-based inheritance planning. Many of them had their own concerns about family members who seemed more interested in inheriting wealth than in earning respect, and they wanted to learn from Uncle Bob's example about how to ensure their legacies would be protected from relatives who might prioritize immediate gratification over long-term responsibility. Following the conference, I began consulting with families throughout the region who wanted to implement similar protection strategies for their estates and businesses. The consulting work became another way to honor Uncle Bob's memory while helping other families avoid the kind of betrayal and legal complications that had threatened to destroy everything he had built. The consulting practice grew into a specialized service that attracted clients from throughout the Midwest, business owners who had built successful companies and wanted to ensure that their life's work would continue benefiting their communities rather than being liquidated by heirs who didn't understand the difference between inheriting assets and inheriting responsibility. Each family situation was unique, but the patterns were remarkably similar to what Uncle Bob had experienced with my genetic relatives. Adult children who had shown little interest in family businesses suddenly became very interested when inheritance planning was discussed. Relatives who had been absent during health crises appeared immediately when estate lawyers were mentioned. Family members who had never demonstrated responsibility or work ethic began making assumptions about inheriting wealth they hadn't earned through contribution or character. Working with these families helped me understand that Uncle Bob's experience wasn't unusual or particularly shocking. Family betrayal around inheritance was unfortunately common, with many successful people discovering that relatives viewed their death as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than a loss to be grieved. The difference was that most people didn't have Uncle Bob's foresight, planning ability, and determination to protect their legacies from people who would destroy them for immediate financial gain. The most rewarding aspect of the consulting work was helping families create positive succession plans that would benefit deserving heirs while protecting family businesses from relatives who lacked the character or competence to manage inherited responsibility. These plans often included character-based criteria for inheritance, educational requirements for business succession, and community service commitments that would ensure inherited wealth would be used to build rather than consume. 15 years after Uncle Bob's death, Mitchell Family Construction had grown to employ 63 people across 3 locations in Ohio, with projects extending throughout the Midwest, and a reputation for quality craftsmanship that attracted clients who specifically requested our services for challenging restoration and custom construction projects. The business success felt meaningful because it honored Uncle Bob's vision while providing good careers for skilled workers who shared his commitment to excellence and integrity. But the personal success felt even more meaningful because it represented complete freedom from the toxic family dynamics that had threatened to define my life through other people's moral failures. Tom and I had built a marriage based on mutual respect and shared values, surrounded by chosen family members who demonstrated daily what healthy relationships actually looked like when they were based on genuine care rather than manipulation and obligation. The farmhouse on Riverside Road had become a gathering place for celebrations and community events, filled with laughter from people who enjoyed each other's company without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. The workshop where Uncle Bob had taught me carpentry skills continued serving as a teaching space where we passed on traditional craftsmanship techniques to young people who wanted to learn trades that would provide stable careers and personal satisfaction. The charitable foundation that Uncle Bob had established continued growing and expanding its impact, with scholarship recipients going on to successful careers that contributed to their community's economic health and social stability. The foundation's annual awards ceremony had become a prestigious recognition throughout Central Ohio, celebrating young people who embodied the values of honest work, community service, and ethical behavior that Uncle Bob had spent his lifetime promoting. Looking back on the inheritance fraud that had once seemed so devastating, I could honestly say that it had been the beginning of the best part of my life. Not because I enjoyed being betrayed by family members or fighting legal battles to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but because it had taught me lessons about integrity, relationships, and the true meaning of family that had guided every important decision I had made since then. Uncle Bob's final gift hadn't been protection from family betrayal, it had been education about building a life based on authentic values rather than inherited obligations, choosing relationships based on character rather than genetics, and understanding that real wealth came from contributing to something larger than immediate personal gratification. The story that began with family members celebrating stolen inheritance ended with understanding that some victories were won not through defeating enemies, but through building something so meaningful that their attempts at destruction became irrelevant. Uncle Bob had taught me that the most powerful response to betrayal was living well, and 15 years later, I was still learning new applications of that lesson every day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.